We only kept you for the benefits, sweetheart. And now you're not useful. My mother said it over the bread basket, and the whole room went very quiet and very far away. 21 years in that house, $199,000 in state checks with my name printed on them, and not one of those dollars ever reached me. I didn't cry. I just looked past her shoulder at table 11, where 4 people were sitting who my mother had never met. Let me back up, because I want you to understand exactly how a woman gets to a restaurant table on her 25th birthday with her hands perfectly still. My name is Nora Ellison. I was born on the 14th of March, in the year 2000, in a county hospital with a broken elevator, and I was in foster care by 5 weeks old. At 14 months, I was placed with Richard and Diane Ellison of 42 Holloway Court, a beige house with a good roof and a bad crawl space. The adoption was finalized on January 9, 2002. I was 21 months old. In the photograph from the courthouse, Diane is holding me on her hip and looking at the camera, and Richard has his hand on the shoulder of their son Trevor, who was 5, and who is the only person in that picture who looks like anyone else in it. I want to be fair because bitterness makes a story smaller. They fed me. They took me to the dentist. There were birthday cakes, and a bike with a bent fender that had been Trevor's, and a Christmas. When I got a microscope, and cried because it was the first thing I ever owned that no one had owned before me. I loved them. That's the part people skip when they hear stories like mine. I loved them the way you love the ground, without noticing, because it's simply the thing holding you up. But there were 2 houses inside that house, and I lived in the smaller one. Trevor had a bedroom with a window seat. I had the room over the garage that never got warm, and in February, I slept in a sweatshirt with the hood up. Trevor got braces at 12. I got a retainer at 15, second-hand fitted, from a clinic that took the county card. When I was 16 and made varsity, the fee was $220, and Diane said, in the voice she used for arithmetic, "Honey, we just can't." That same spring, Trevor came home with a used jet ski on a trailer, and Richard stood in the driveway looking at it like a man looking at his own reflection. We can't afford it, that was the family scripture. I heard it so many times it stopped being a sentence and became a sound, like a screen door. And I believed it, of course I believed it. I was a child, and children don't audit their parents. So I earned. That's the shape of my life from 16 on. I bussed tables at a diner on Ferris Road for $4.10 an hour plus tips. I worked a register. I cleaned 3 offices on Sunday mornings with a woman named Lupe who taught me that if you do the baseboards first, nobody ever looks at the baseboards again. I graduated high school in June of 2018 with $1,100 saved and a plan I'd built entirely by myself, because when I asked about college, Richard said there was nothing set aside, and I remember he said it while looking at the television. I went to community college for 2 years and then to the state school, and I finished a bachelor's in health information management in May of 2022, at 22 with $41,300 in loans. I lived at home for those 4 years. And here is the number that mattered later, so hold on to it. I paid Richard and Diane $700 a month in board from April of 2018 until March of 2022. 48 months, $33,600. $33,600, paid by a girl in a room over a garage, to the people collecting money on her behalf. I didn't know that last part yet, we'll get there. In June of 2022, I started at Brightwater Health Partners as a claims auditor. And I need you to understand what that job actually is, because everything that happens later grows out of it. A claims auditor reads paperwork that was written to be skimmed. That's it, that's the whole craft. Somebody submits a bundle of documents designed to look complete, and my job is to notice that page 4 references an attachment that page 11 says was waived, and that the dates in the header don't survive contact with the dates in the ledger. People think it's about math, it isn't. It's about patience and about the specific kind of stubbornness that refuses to accept a summary when the underlying record exists. I was good at it by my third year. My salary is $58,400. I rent a one-bedroom over a laundromat on Corbin Street for $1,150 a month, and the floor is warm all winter because of the dryers, which after that room over the garage still feels like a small miracle every night. And I kept paying. God, I kept paying. November of 2021. Diane's dental implants, $4,800 on my credit card, because the practice wouldn't do a payment plan and she cried at the kitchen table. August of 2022. Richard's transmission, $3,200. February of 2023. Trevor's intake deposit at a facility in Reedsburg, $2,500. June of that same year. $5,500 toward his legal fees after the second DUI, wired on a Thursday from my lunch break. And starting in January of 2023, a standing automatic transfer of $400 a month into Diane's checking account. She called it the family fund. It ran 26 months, $10,400. Add it up with me, $33,600, $4,800, $3,200, $2,500, $5,500, $10,400, $60,000. $60,000 from a woman who has never once flown on a plane out of the hands of a woman who was told her whole childhood that there was nothing set aside. I'm not telling you that to make you angry on my behalf. I'm telling you so you can see the shape of me before any of this started. I was not a wounded person waiting for a reason. I was a cheerful, tired, useful daughter who paid her way and everyone else's, who brought a pie to Thanksgiving and stayed to do the dishes, and who believed, right up to the very end, that if she was good enough for long enough, she would eventually be counted. That's what they were relying on, not my stupidity, my hope. Those are different things, and the second one is much harder to give up. One more thing before we go on, and I'm telling you in order, the way it happened, because I don't want you thinking later that I invented a family to win an argument. In June of 2024, I had a physical, and the nurse practitioner asked whether anyone in my family had a history of long QT syndrome. I opened my mouth and nothing came out. I said, I'm adopted. She said, do you have the medical history from the agency? And I said, I don't know. That sat on me for 3 weeks like a hand on the back of my neck. 24 years old, and I could not answer one question about my own body. So in July, I spent $79 on a plastic tube, spat into it in my kitchen feeling ridiculous, mailed it, and forgot about it the way you forget a lottery ticket. The results came on the 19th of August, 2024. There was a match at the top of the list. The label said, parent/child, 49.7% shared DNA. And there was a name. I did not call for 18 days. I made myself imagine every version, the one where she didn't want to hear from me, the one where she was gone, the one where she was awful. And then on the 6th of September, at 7:40 in the evening, sitting in my car in a grocery store parking lot with the engine off, I called a phone number in a town 90 minutes north, and a woman answered on the second ring, and I said, hi. My name is Nora. I think you might be my mother. And she made a sound I have never heard another human being make. Remember that date, the 6th of September. Everything else in this story is downstream of it, and none of them knew it had happened. The first thing I noticed was a word. It was October of 2024, a Sunday, and I'd driven over to Halloway Court to reset the router because Diane can't do it and won't learn. Richard was on the phone in the den with the door half open, and he said, no, the other one. The younger one, a pause, no, the one we took in, the one we took in. I stood in the hallway with a router password in my hand, and I felt something move under the floor of my life. Not a crack, just a shift, the way a house settles at night, and you tell yourself it's nothing. He hung up, came out, kissed the top of my head, and asked if I wanted a beer. And I said yes, and I drank it, and I laughed at something Trevor said about work, and I drove home. Because that's what you do with a single strange sentence. You file it. But I'm an auditor, and auditors don't have one finding, we have a first finding. The second was the mail. I'd been getting my mail at Holloway Court for years out of pure inertia. The bank, the loan. Servicer, the Alumni Association, all of it still went to my parents' address because changing it required 40 minutes, and I never had 40 minutes. In November, Diane started meeting me at the door, not inviting me in first, meeting me. With the small stack already sorted, already handed over, already thinned. And when I said casually, "Was there anything else?" she said, "Just junk, honey." I tossed it, and she said it a half second too fast. Half a second, that's all it was. But in my job, a half second is a flag. The third thing was Trevor's kitchen. Trevor is my brother. I want to say that plainly, because it stayed true even after everything, and because if I let you think of him as a villain, you'll misunderstand the ending. He was born in June of 1996, which made him 28 that autumn, and he had been, at various points, a decent brother and a disaster. He'd been sober 14 months. He was working at a lumberyard. He had a girlfriend named Steph who was too good for the version of him I knew, and in November he got his kitchen redone. Cabinets, quartz counter, a range with 6 burners for a man who eats cereal. I said, "This is beautiful. How'd you swing it?" And he said without looking up, Dad helped. Richard Ellison, who did not have $220 for a varsity fee in 2016, helped. I went home that night and sat on the floor of my apartment with my back against the couch, and I made a list. Not of grievances, of transactions. That's the difference between being hurt and being dangerous, and I want you to hear me on this. Because it's the only real advice I have. When something is wrong, stop describing your feelings and start describing the money. Feelings can be argued with, a ledger cannot. The list was ugly. Fourth, and this is the one that turned the key, Thanksgiving. I was in the pantry getting the second can of cranberry, and Diane was in the kitchen with her sister Roberta, and Roberta said something I couldn't hear, and Diane said, clear as a bell over the exhaust fan, "Well, after March it's a moot point. I stood in that pantry with a can in each hand and I understood, in the way you understand a stare. That isn't there, that my birthday was a deadline. Not a celebration, a deadline. Somebody, somewhere, had a date on a calendar and the date was mine, and it was not mine because they loved me. I came out of the pantry smiling. I said, "Aunt Bertie, you look wonderful." I fixed the disposal. I did the dishes. I hugged everyone at the door and drove home doing 40 and a 50, because my hands were shaking. Too hard to trust at speed. That was the night it stopped being sadness and became work. Here's the thing about the decision. People imagine a moment of rage, a broken plate, a scream in a car. There wasn't one. There was a woman at 11:40 on Thanksgiving night, 2024, sitting cross-legged on a rug with a laptop, typing 7 words into a search bar. What does moot point mean? In a will. Because I already knew. Some part of me had known since Richard said the one we took in. And what I felt was not fury. It was something colder and much more useful. It was the feeling I get at work at about 4 in the afternoon, when a file stops being a file and starts being a story somebody is trying to tell me. I thought about my grandmother, Margaret F. Ellison, Richard's mother. She died in October of 2009, when I was 9 years old, and I remember her clearly. Which is more than I can say for a lot of that decade. She smelled like violet pastils. She kept butterscotch in a dish shaped like a swan. She called me Little Bird, and once, at a family cookout, she took my chin in her hand and said, "In front of everybody, this one doesn't miss a thing." I have carried that sentence for 16 years like a coin in a coat pocket. And I remembered, the way children remember weather, that there had been talk after she died. Papers, a lawyer's office with a green awning, Richard irritable for months, and then nothing. Not a dollar, not a mention. When I asked about college in 2018, nobody said the word trust. So on the Friday after Thanksgiving, at 9 in the morning, in sweatpants, with cold coffee, I opened the county probate records portal, and typed in Margaret F. Ellison. It took 4 minutes. The Margaret F. Ellison Family Trust, established 2004. Restated 2008. And beneath it, a docket entry so recent the ink was practically wet. Petition for instructions re. Construction of beneficiary class. Filed December 3rd, no. Filed the 3rd of December, which was still 4 days away. I sat there and looked at a lawsuit that hadn't happened yet, scheduled against a woman who wasn't supposed to know she was a party to it. And I did the single most important thing I did in this entire story. I did nothing. I closed the laptop, I got dressed, and I went to a diner and ate eggs, and I let myself feel every single thing I was going to feel, all of it, the whole flood, in a vinyl booth with a jukebox, playing something with a steel guitar in it, so that I would never again have to feel it in a room where they could see me. You get one collapse, spend it somewhere private, then get up. There is one person I told, and I told her on a Monday, in a conference room with a broken blind, over a cardboard cup of the worst coffee in the state of Ohio. Colleen Boyle is 61 and has run the audit floor at Brightwater for 19 years. Reading glasses on a beaded chain, a laugh like a door slamming, and on her office wall a framed photocopy of a 1998 denial letter she overturned on appeal for a widow. Zanesville. That's her trophy, a photocopy. I have loved her since my first week. I'd planned to ask a hypothetical. But 2 sentences in, my voice did something I didn't authorize, and Colleen shut the door with her foot without breaking eye contact. I told her all of it, the one we took in, the mail at the door, the moot point over the exhaust fan, the docket entry with a date on it that hadn't arrived yet. And when I finished, I said, I think I sound insane. She said, you sound like an auditor with a partial record. That's it, that's all she said, and something in my chest unlocked. Then she let her glasses fall on the chain and said, Nora, I'm going to tell you something, and then I'm going to tell you what to do. She turned her mug a quarter turn. I was adopted, 1964, Pittsburgh. My mother was a decent woman who did an indecent thing. She let me believe for 30 years that nobody had ever come looking. There were letters. I found out at 34 when she was in hospice and could not be asked about it. The blind ticked against the window. So here's what to do, she said. You do not confront, you do not hint. You do not call your mother and cry. Confrontation is a request for permission, and you are done requesting things. What you do instead is what we do here. You pull the file, not the summary, the underlying record. You go to the source that has no reason to protect them, the state, the county, the trustee, the agency. Institutions are terrible at love and wonderful at record keeping. She put her glasses back on. And follow the money to the last dollar, then follow it one more. The last dollar is where they got sloppy, because by then they'd stopped being afraid. I wrote that on an index card. It is still on my refrigerator. Then she said the thing I actually needed, which had nothing to do with strategy. She said, you have not been unlovable, you have been useful. Those get confused in houses like that, and the confusion belongs to them, not to you. I did not cry in the conference room. I want that on the record. I made it to the stairwell, so I pulled the file, all of them. Here's how in order, because the order mattered. Stage 1 was addresses, and it was boring, and it was the most important thing I did. On the 2nd of December, one day before the petition landed, I spent an evening severing every thread that ran through 42 Holloway Court. Bank, loan servicer, employer, county, the post office. I froze my credit at all 3 bureaus. I opened an account at credit union my family had never heard of, moved my direct deposit, and left $40 in the old one like a light on in an empty house. And on the 3rd of December, at 7:02 in the morning, I canceled the $400 automatic transfer to Diane's checking account. 26 months, $10,400. Gone in one click, at 7 in the morning, in the dark, in my kitchen. She noticed on the 11th, she texted, Han, did something happen with the transfer? Bank glitch. I texted back, I'll look into it. 3 words and an exclamation point, which is the most powerful sentence in the English language. When you have already looked into it. Stage 2 was the record request, and this is where it stopped being a suspicion. I filed a public records request with the County Department of Job and Family Services for the complete payment history of any adoption assistance agreement executed in my name. 19 days, $31 in copy fees. It arrived in a manila envelope on the 23rd of December, and I opened it standing in my hallway with my coat still on. It was a spreadsheet. It was 4 pages long. It was the most boring document I have ever read, and it rearranged my entire understanding of my own childhood. An adoption assistance subsidy had been paid to Richard and Diane Ellison on my behalf, beginning the February after my adoption was finalized and running until the January before I turned 18. 192 consecutive payments, $1,040 each. $199,680. I stood in my hallway and I did the arithmetic out loud, slowly, like a woman learning a language. $200,000 for the raising of me. Paid monthly, on time, for 16 years, into the hands of 2 people who told a 16-year-old girl in a kitchen with a humming refrigerator that they just couldn't do $220. There was a Medicaid number I'd never seen, which explained the second-hand retainer. And a line item I read 6 times. A clothing and activity allowance, $480 a year for 16 years, $7,680, itemized, disbursed, and as far as my body recalls, entirely theoretical. Stage 3 was the trust, and for that I needed to stop being clever alone. Court filings have exhibits, and exhibits are public. On the 8th of December, I paid $4.50 to download 11 pages of my grandmother's trust. I read it at my kitchen table with a legal dictionary open on my phone, and it took me most of a Sunday, and I understood perhaps 60% of it. But 60% was enough. Article 4 established an education distribution, $6,000 per year per grandchild. From age 10 through age 22 inclusive, paid to a custodial recipient for the benefit of that grandchild. The named custodial recipient for minors was Richard T. Ellison. Distributions began in January of 2010, after the estate settled. In January of 2010, I was 9 years old and 2 months from 10. Trevor was 13. Trevor, ages 13 through 22, 10 payments, $60,000. Me, ages 10 through 22, 13 payments, $78,000. $78,000, disbursed in my name over 13 years, ending the same spring I graduated $41,300 in debt. I put my forehead on the table. Then I kept reading because Article 6 was worse and better. Article 6 was the residuary. The remainder of the trust, everything not spent on education, was to be held and then distributed in equal shares to my grandchildren then living, on a single date, the 25th birthday of the youngest surviving grandchild. The youngest surviving grandchild is me. The distribution date of the Margaret F. Ellison Family Trust was the 14th of March, 2025, my birthday. My grandmother, 16 years in the ground, had reached out of it and put my name on a calendar. And my father had built an entire winter around erasing it. Well, after March, it's a moot point. I called the trustee the next morning. Halstead Fiduciary Services, a stone building downtown, a trust officer named Warren Ng who has the voice of a man who has never once been late for anything. I gave him my name and my date of birth. There was a pause of maybe 4 seconds. Then, carefully, Miss Ellison, you are listed as a beneficiary of record. May I ask, have you received the notices? I said, what notices? Another pause. Longer, he said, Miss Ellison, I'd like you to update your address of record with us today, in writing. And I would encourage you to obtain counsel. 3 notices had been mailed. All 3 to 42 Holloway Court, all 3 signed for, now. The part where I heard them say it out loud, The 11th of January, a Saturday. Diane called and asked if I'd come help sort the shoebox of receipts for the accountant, because I'm the one who's good with numbers, which is a sentence that has done a lot of heavy lifting in that family. I said, of course. I brought donuts. I want you to picture me carrying a box of donuts up that driveway, because I want you to understand exactly how completely they still believed in me. I let myself in. The den door was mostly shut. There was a speakerphone going, and a man's voice I didn't know, and I stopped in the hallway with my coat on and a warm box in my hands, exactly where I'd stood in October. The man said, the hearing's set for April 4th. My concern is only the notice issue, Richard said. She's got no idea. She's never once asked about my mother's money. Diane laughed, not a cruel laugh, worse. A comfortable one, she said. Phil, she's 25. She doesn't know what a residuary clause is. She thinks a trust is something on a television show. The man Philip Braddock, whose name I would later read on every page, said, and if she surfaces, and Richard said, then we sit her down and we're honest with her. We tell her the truth about where she came from. We hand her $5,000 for a fresh start, and she signs the disclaimer. She's a soft kid. She'll be so busy being sad she'll sign anything you put in front of her. Diane said, do it on her birthday. She'll be sentimental. And then, this is the sentence. This is the one that lives in me, Diane said. Honestly, Richard, she's had $200,000 of our life already. It's not as though she came free. $200,000 of our life. She meant the subsidy. She meant the money the state of Ohio paid them to raise me. She had held that number in her head for 16 years, and she had filed it under sacrifice. I put the donuts on the hall table. I took off my coat. I sorted that shoebox for 2 hours and 40 minutes and found a mileage deduction that saved them $310, and Diane kissed my cheek at the door and said, what would we do without you? And I said, you'd manage. I meant it as a joke. It wasn't one. 10 days later, the manila envelope from Fenwick County Children's Services arrived. I had requested my adoption file in October, right after the phone call in the parking lot, because Sandy had said something on that first call that I couldn't put down. She'd said, I wrote to you every year. Did you ever get any of them? I'd said no, and I'd assumed she was misremembering or softening something the way people do. There were 22 letters in that envelope. One every March, from 2003 to 2024. 22 envelopes, addressed in the same handwriting, getting slowly steadier, sent care of the agency, opened by the agency, filed by the agency, and never forwarded, because on the 9th of April 2003, Richard and Diane Ellison had signed a contact preference form electing no contact, and they had renewed that election every 5 years, and the last renewal was dated the 9th of April 2023. 2023, I was 23 years old. I had my own apartment, my own job, my own tax return, my own key. And my parents drove to an office on a Tuesday and signed a form on my behalf, as though I were a child who could still be spoken for, to make certain that a woman 90 minutes north could not reach me. I read all 22 in one sitting on my living room floor, oldest to newest. The early ones say things like, you are 3 today, and I don't know what you look like. The late ones say things like, I am not going to ask you for anything. I only want you to know you were not thrown away. You were taken from me by a 19-year-old's terrible year, and I have been sorry every day since. I'm going to stop for 1 second, because if you've made it this far with me, you already know what that floor felt like, and I don't want to be alone on it. Subscribe and stay with me. I'd like you here for what happens at that table, and for what my mother's face does when she turns around. If you can hit like 2, it helps this find whoever needs it tonight. Okay. Back to the floor, and to the 22nd letter, dated March of 2024, which ends with a phone number. The number I'd already called. Because a plastic tube and $79 had done what the United States Postal Service had been prevented from doing 22 consecutive times. That was the night I stopped thinking about fairness and started thinking about February. Divi Ramanathan keeps her office above a Portuguese bakery on Ashfield Avenue, and the whole second floor smells like custard tarts, which I have decided is the correct smell for a place where people find out the truth about their families. She is 53, and she has litigated trust disputes for 19 years, and she pushes her reading glasses up into her hair and forgets they're there. I brought her a binder, tabbed, indexed, 406 pages. She flipped through it for 11 minutes without saying a word, and then she looked up and said, "Who put this together?" I said, "I did. I audit medical claims." She took the glasses out of her hair, put them on, and said, "Miss Ellison, I've had partners at large firms hand me worse." Her retainer was $3,500. I paid it out of the account they didn't know about, and I want to say something about that check. Because it's the single best money I have ever spent, and it did not feel that way at the time. It felt like setting fire to 2 months of rent on a maybe. Sometimes the right decision feels exactly like a mistake. You do it anyway, and you find out later. Here's what Divi did in 6 weeks. First, she killed the notice problem. On the 4th of February, she filed a notice of appearance and a written objection, with a sworn statement that all 3 trustee notices had gone to an address I hadn't lived at since March of 2022 and been signed for by someone other than me. The April 4th hearing was no longer a formality with an empty chair in it. It was a fight. Second, she filed a beneficiary's demand for a full accounting of the Margaret F. Ellison family trust from inception. Halstead had to produce. Warren Ing produced beautifully. I think he'd been waiting years for someone to ask. 240 pages came back, and in them was the thing that turned my defense into something else entirely. Article 4 didn't just hand Richard the education money. It made him a custodian with a fiduciary duty, and it required annual certification. Every year from 2010 to 2022, someone had signed a 1-page form certifying that the $6,000 distributed for the benefit of Nora M. Ellison had been applied to her education and had attached documentation. 13 forms. 12 signed by Richard T. Ellison. 1, 2017, signed by Diane R. Ellison. And the attached documentation. Tuition invoices from Trevor's school in Kent, the name blacked out badly enough to read if you tilted the page. A receipt for a laptop. 2 years of educational travel. And in 2016, the year I didn't play varsity. Because of $220, a bill of sale for a personal watercraft, $7,200, described on the certification form as recreational therapy equipment, the jet ski, in the driveway, with Richard standing beside it with his hands on his hips. Divi read that page twice and set it down very gently, the way you set down something that is going to be an exhibit. Then she found Article 9. Article 9 was my grandmother's last, quietest act of intelligence. Any beneficiary or custodial recipient who diverts or misapplies trust property forfeits his interest and the interest of his issue in the residuary, and is personally liable for restitution. With statutory interest, the residuary held $412,000. Split 2 ways, that was $206,000 each. Divi said, "Do you understand what you're holding? They walked into court to take $206,000 from you, and in doing so they opened a door that lets us take all $412 from them. The $78,000 alone, with statutory interest since 2010, runs to about $116,000. I sat in that little office with the custard smell coming up through the floor, and I felt no triumph at all. I felt tired and about 9 years old, and I said, "I don't want to destroy them." And Divi said, "Good. Because that's leverage, and leverage is only worth something if you don't spend it." So we built. The third thing, the offer. 1 page, drafted by Divi, dated the 12th of March. Withdraw the petition with prejudice. Consent to the distribution as written. Repay $116,000 on a schedule. In exchange, No claim under Article 9, no referral, no contest of Trevor's share. Signed, it cost them money. Unsigned, it cost them everything. And then Diane called me, on the 2nd of March in her sweetest voice, and asked me to keep the 14th free. Just the 4 of us, she said. Your father and I want to talk to you about something important, and then we're going to celebrate. You properly. The Larkspur Room, 7 o'clock. Wear something nice. I said, I'd love that, Mom, and I hung up and I called Sandy Whitlock and I said, are you free on the 14th? There were 4 of them at table 11 that night, and I need you to know who. Sandra Whitlock, 44, who was 19 when she had me, who works at a veterinary clinic and has a laugh that starts before the joke lands. Ruth Whitlock, 68, my grandmother, who tried to stop the relinquishment in 2001 and lost, and who has carried a photograph of a 2-day-old baby in her wallet for 25 years. Elliot Whitlock, 19, my half-brother, 6'3", terrified of me, who brought me a plant. And Divi Ramanathan, who is not my family, who was there because she is very good at her job and because she said, I'd like to see their faces, and I have never respected a professional more. They arrived at 6:40, they were seated before we were. Ruth ordered the chicken. The Larkspur Room has white cloths, low amber light, and a maitre d' named Anton who has worked there since before I was born. Our table was 14, by the window. Table 11 is on the far wall, 3 tables back and slightly left of where Diane was sitting. She had done her hair, that's the detail I keep. And she wore the pearl earrings I bought her for her 60th, $340, from a jeweler on Water Street, paid off over 4 months. Richard stood when I came in, he hugged me. He said, there she is. 25. Trevor was already there, drinking club soda with lime, and he had gotten a haircut. And he looked, more than anything else, nervous. He kept turning his glass. We ordered. I had the halibut. Diane asked about work, and I told a story about a coding error that had cost a hospital $11,000, and Richard said, that's my girl, sharp as a tack, and everyone laughed, and I laughed too, and inside me, there was a room with the lights off. They waited until the plates were cleared. Of course they did. That's technique. You don't do it while people still have knives in their hands. Diane put both palms flat on the tablecloth and said, sweetheart, your father and I want to talk to you about something we should have said a long time ago, and Richard said it. Plainly, almost kindly, which was somehow the worst part. Nora, you're adopted. I looked at him. I let 3 full seconds go by, because I wanted to know what he'd do with them, and what he did was smile with relief and reach over and pat my hand. We took you in when you were a baby, he said. We never wanted you to feel different. And then Diane leaned in, and her face did something I had never seen it do. It got lighter, the way a face gets when a person finally puts down a heavy bag. And she said, we only kept you for the benefits, sweetheart. And now you're not useful. She said it the way you'd explain a bus schedule. She kept going. She said the state paid them, and she said the number, $200,000, our life, the way she'd said it in the den, and she said nobody understands what a burden a child like that is. And that they'd done their duty, every year, and nobody could say they hadn't. Trevor said, Mom, quietly, she didn't hear him. And Richard slid the leather folio across the tablecloth. There's an estate matter. Your grandmother's trust. We filed a petition to clarify that it goes to blood descendants, which is what she intended, and frankly, Nora, it's what's fair. Trevor's her grandson. He tapped the folio. There's a disclaimer in there. You sign it, we're all done, and there's a check for $5,000. A fresh start. No hard feelings, kiddo. The check was paperclipped to the front, $5,000. $2,500 a decade, roughly, for the pleasure of my company. I didn't cry. I want to tell you exactly what I felt, because I think it might be useful to somebody. I felt the strangest, warmest wave of relief. Because for 25 years, I had carried a low, humming suspicion that something about me was wrong, that I was slightly too much, or slightly not enough, or that whatever makes a mother look at a daughter and go soft simply hadn't been installed in me. And in that moment, at that table, with the pearl earrings and the folio and the check, I understood that it had never been about me at all. I was not unlovable. I was a line item. That is a terrible thing to learn. It is also, and I mean this, a very light thing to carry compared to the alternative. I picked up my water, I took a sip, I set it down. And I said, "Can I tell you something funny first?" Diane said, "Of course, honey," with her head tilted, already forgiving me for whatever small sad thing I was about to say. I said, "I found my birth family 6 months ago." The tilt went out of her head. I said, "The 6th of September. I called her from a grocery store parking lot. Her name is Sandra Whitlock. She was 19 when she had me, and she has written to me every March since 2003. I let that sit. 22 letters, I have all of them. They came in a county envelope, along with the contact preference forms the two of you signed in 2003, 2008, 2013, 2018, and the 9th of April 2023. Richard's jaw moved. "And the funny part," I said, "is that she's sitting 3 tables behind you. Nobody moved for a second." And then Diane turned around. She turned slowly. That's what I remember when everything else has gone soft, how slowly she turned, one shoulder at a time, like a woman lowering herself into cold water. Her hand stayed flat on the tablecloth the whole way around. Table 11, 4 people. Ruth Whitlock with her chicken half-eaten and her chin up. Elliot, 19, going scarlet and lifting one hand in a small wave, because he is 19 and that is what 19 does. Sandy looking straight back at her, not smiling, not glaring, just looking the way you look at weather coming across a field. And Devi Ramanathan, in a gray suit already standing. Diane turned back around. Her mouth was open slightly. She said, "Which one?" And I said, "The one who looks like me." Divi came over, she did not hurry. She set 2 bound copies on the table and said, "Mr. Ellison, Mrs. Ellison. Devi Ramanathan, I represent your daughter. Courtesy copies of the objection, filed February 4th, in the matter of the Margaret F. Ellison Family Trust, and the accounting demand granted February 20th. You've both been served at your correct addresses." Richard said, "This is a family dinner." Devi said, "Yes. I'm told those are the ones that matter." And she went back to table 11 and sat down and unfolded her napkin. Then I talked, and I talked for about 6 minutes, and I didn't raise my voice once. I said, 192 payments of $1,040. $199,680. Plus $7,680 in clothing allowance, and I would very much like to know what I wore. I said, 13 education distributions in my name, 6,000 each, $78,000. Certified by your signature 12 times and by yours once, Mom, in 2017. I said, in 2016, you certified a $7,200 personal watercraft as recreational therapy equipment for a girl who was told there was no money for a $220 varsity fee. I watched Trevor put his hand over his mouth. I said, 33,600 in board, 4,800 for your implants, 3,200 for the transmission, 2,500 for Reedsburg, 5,500 for the lawyer, 10,400 in the family fund. $60,000, exactly, out of a woman making $58,400 a year with $41,300 in loans. And then I said the last thing, and I said it to Richard, because Article 9 is his problem. I said Grandma put a forfeiture clause in Article 9. A custodian who misapplies trust property forfeits his interest and the interest of his issue, and owes restitution with statutory interest. The residuary is $412,000. You filed a petition to take $206,000 of it away from me, and by filing it you put all $412 in play, plus about $116,000 in restitution. Diane said she's 25. She said it to Richard, not to me, as though I were being discussed. Richard, she's 25, she doesn't, and I said, Mom, I read the trust in one Sunday. It took me 4 hours and a library card. You spent 3 months and a retainer building something a 25-year-old could take apart at. Her kitchen table. The problem was never that I was young. The problem was that you never once, in 25 years, actually looked at me. She looked at me. And she said, "You were never what I thought you were." And I said, "No, I was always exactly this. You just weren't paying attention." Here's what people get wrong about moments like that. They imagine the family crumbles. They don't, they reorganize. Diane did not break. A story where the villain dissolves is a story you can't learn anything from. She sat up straighter and became, within about 40 seconds, the most wronged woman in Ohio. She said, "We gave you a home." She said, "Do you know what we gave up?" She said, "That woman gave you away, and I got up at 2 in the morning with you." And then, verbatim, "I fed you for 21 years, Nora, 21 years of groceries." I said, 16 of them at $1,040 a month. She said, "That is not the point." I said, "Mom, it's the only point. It's been the point since 2001, when somebody at an agency ran the numbers and you said." Yes, Richard went the other direction. Richard went quiet and practical, which is how he handles anything with a dollar sign, and after a minute he said, "What do you want?" It was the first honest sentence anyone in my family had said to me in a decade. I told him Divi would send the proposal Monday morning. Withdraw with prejudice. Consent to the distribution. Repay $116,000 on a schedule. In exchange, no Article 9 claim, no referral, and I would not touch Trevor's $206,000. Diane said, "You'd take our house." I said, "No. I'd take my grandmother's money back, and I'd leave you your house, and you'd hate that more." Trevor is the one who broke. He'd been sitting there the whole time with his hand over his mouth, and when I said I wasn't going to touch his share, he made a sound and stood up so fast his chair went over backward, and Anton looked over from the maitre d' stand and then decided, wisely, to look at something else. Trevor said, "The Kent tuition." He was looking at Richard. "Dad, you told me that was your money. You told me you were proud you could do it." Richard said, "Trevor, sit down. You told me it was your money," louder. "I let her pay $2,500 to get me into Reedsburg. She wired me $5,500 for the lawyer and never said a word about it, and he stopped. He looked at me, eyes completely wrecked. "Nora, I didn't know about the letters. I swear on my sobriety I didn't know there were letters. And here's the thing, I believed him. I still do. Trevor Ellison is not a good man yet. He is working on it, a day at a time, and he has done real damage in his life. But he did not know, and when he found out, he stood up in a restaurant and said so in front of his mother. That cost him something. I have decided it counts. He said, 'What do I do?' I said, 'Sit down and finish your soda. And then on Monday, you can tell Divi what Dad told you about the Kent invoices, if you want to.' He sat down. He finished his soda. And Diane said to him, not to me, 'Don't you dare.' Nobody had cake at table 14. At some point, I realized I'd been holding my napkin in my fist for 10 minutes, and I set it down. And I said, 'I'm going to go sit with my other family now.' Richard said, 'Nora,' I said, 'happy to. Talk Monday, Dad.' And I picked up my bag and walked 12 feet and sat down at table 11 and Ruth Whitlock took my hand without a word and held it flat between both of hers on the tablecloth. And Elliot said, 'Happy birthday,' and pushed a small potted jade plant across at me, and Sandy looked at the side of my face for a long moment and said, 'You okay, kid?' And that was when I cried. Not at table 14. At table 11, over a jade plant, with a waiter bringing a slice of chocolate cake with one candle in it that 4 people had arranged an hour earlier without telling me. They signed on the 28th of March. Braddock advised them to. I suspect he took one look at the 2017 certification, with Diane's signature on it, and understood exactly how a hearing would go. The petition was withdrawn with prejudice on the 1st of April, 3 days before it would have been heard. The residuary distributed on the 9th of June, $206,000 to Trevor T. Ellison and $206,000 to Nora M. Ellison, from the estate of a woman who once held my chin in her hand and said, in front of everybody, this one doesn't miss a thing. The restitution is coming in at $1,450 a month for 80 months. The first payment cleared on the 1st of July, 2025. It still clears every month, and I have never once celebrated it. I paid off $41,300 in student loans on the 11th of June. I put $52,000 down on a small blue house with a bad porch and a good furnace, and I don't sleep in a sweatshirt anymore. I opened an account for Elliot, who wants to be a large animal vet, and when I told him, he cried harder than I did, which I found deeply annoying and also perfect. And I gave Colleen Boyle a bottle of very expensive scotch and a framed photocopy of the 2016 certification with the words recreational therapy equipment on it. She hung it next to the Zanesville letter. Trevor calls on Sundays. He is at 31 months sober, and he has paid back all $8,000 he owed me, in increments. Unprompted. We are not close. We are honest, which turns out to be a different thing, and at this stage, a better one. Richard sent a card in November. It said, thinking of you. I have not answered it, I might. Diane has not written. Sandy asked once if that hurts. I said yes, then sat with it and said, actually, less than you'd think, because the woman who would have to write that letter has never existed, and I spent 25 years waiting on the mail for her. Last month I turned 26. 11 of us at a wobbly table in my dining room. Sandy, Ruth, Elliot, Devi, Colleen, and her husband, a few people from work. Ruth made the chicken. Somebody put 26 candles on a store-bought cake. The smoke set off the detector. Elliot stood on a chair swinging a dish towel at the ceiling, and I laughed in my own kitchen until my ribs hurt. Here's what I know now, and then I'll let you go. Being useful and being loved feel identical from the inside when you're young. They are not the same. Love does not send you an invoice, it does not keep the receipt, and it never calculates what you cost. If you are exhausted from proving your worth to people who keep raising the price, the problem isn't that you haven't paid enough. It's that you're in a transaction and you thought you were in a family. And quiet is not weakness. Quiet is a place to work. Every advantage I had in that restaurant came from 4 months of saying, I'll look into it, and then going home and actually looking into it. You don't owe anyone a warning. You don't owe them a scene. Pull the file. Thank you for staying with me tonight. I know I asked a lot of you, a lot of numbers, a lot of floor sitting, and I suspect some of you were hearing your own family somewhere in the middle of mine. If that was you, I hope you heard the part about the jade plant too, because people do show up. Sometimes 90 minutes north, 22 letters deep waiting. I'd love to know where in the world my voice found you. Tell me your city, your country, and what time it is where you are right now. There's something about a comment from someone at 3 a.m. in Manila, sitting next to one from a lunch break in Leeds, that makes this feel less like broadcasting and more like a very long kitchen table. Tell me if you've got a table, 11 of your own. And if this one meant something to you, stay with me, subscribe, and I'll have another story next week. There's always another woman who is underestimated. I'd like you here when she stops being quiet.